Congratulations, thanks for being here. Good afternoon. I'm Venkat, I'm part of the team here at the Archives at NCBS, and I welcome you to this very special public talk by Graham, who's endured 2.5 years of bureaucracy and potential send back at the airport. And we're here, so thanks, Graham, for being here. This is part of a 3-day workshop that we're conducting here at the Archives at NCBS in collaboration with the Center for Public History at Srishti, Indra and Siddhi, who are in the audience, and the Newcastle World History Center, which is headed by Graham here. And it's really my pleasure to introduce Graham and his talk, so I'll be very brief. Graham is a professor of oral history, classics, and archaeology at Newcastle University, where he also leads the university's oral history unit and collective. He's an oral historian with about 30 years of experience of recording and using oral history narratives across a variety of areas, including the history of health, labor, migration, aging, and the family. And then, of course, in all of this work, the focus is on the public and its community facing. He also served as the chair of the Oral History Society between 2004 and 2017, and his work includes collaborations with the NHS, the health service in the UK, and the Changing Families, Changing Food Research Program at Royal Holloway and Sheffield. He's worked in China, Pakistan, and across the UK, including the Roma community in London and the Ukrainian community in Bradford. And today's talk is on the Living Deltas Research Hub and the Living Deltas Project. So, Graham, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me here to this institution. It's the first time I visited. I'm very impressed by both the infrastructure and the colleagues that I've met. I'm less impressed with your administration and bureaucracy, but we've got exactly the same administration and bureaucracy in Newcastle. So it was quite a pleasure trying to negotiate both with Venkat. And I've got to say, Venkat was quite a specialist actually at taking on and changing that bureaucracy. Today I want to talk about Living Deltas, a research hub that I've been engaged with for the last 5 years. The hub itself was a result of UKRI GCRF funding, and that was the major funding package that came through about 6 years ago for UK universities to allow us to do international work. And the hub itself it was a competitive process to produce the hub. We were perhaps about 2 or 3 years in the planning to get the hub off the ground, as part of the original planning committee. It's resulted in 120 members from over 20 academic institutions and 15 academic disciplines across 8 countries, working in partnership with Delta communities to co-produce new understandings of behaviour and response to rising risks and threats to Delta social ecological systems. And we were set 3 tasks. Originally, the funding was thought to be for intractable challenges, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And we were stupid enough to put in for an intractable challenge. But what does intractable mean, we said, as we got the money? I'll come back to that. So the idea was to seek sustainable solutions to environmental changes in the Delta regions, address the UN's Sustainable Development SDGs agenda, more specifically in Deltas. Could we take the SDGs and apply them to Deltas? And to raise resilience and adaptive capacity in Delta populations vulnerable to global change and Delta degradation over time. So, a massively silly challenge in some ways. And we started fairly optimistically. I don't know if people can cast their mind back 5 years, but we were in a much more optimistic place actually in terms of environmental change than we are now. And again, I'll come back to that point. Originally, we thought we would be working in India, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Bangladesh, and that quite quickly became Bangladesh and Vietnam, and the 2 deltas in Vietnam, Red River and Mekong. And the reason for that was twofold. One was the crisis in Myanmar, which meant that we were basically banned from sending researchers there. And secondly, the development of the political developments in India made moving money from the UK to India at that point almost impossible. And again, I'll come back to that question as well. So we ended up in the GBM on the Bangladesh side. There's 130 million people, the world's largest sporting delta, supporting perhaps 300 million people and affected by cyclones. And of course, as an oral historian, I should say what an oral historian does. An oral historian interviews people about their lives, usually on a one-to-one basis. So let's just think about that for a moment in terms of scale. So GBM, 130 million people and supporting 300 million people, and we're going to be interviewing people on a one-to-one basis. You can see the scale of the challenge without. I'll come back again to that point as well. So those are some of the things I'll be trying to cover in this lecture. We also worked in the Mekong in Vietnam. We kind of split the job between two sets of researchers. Another colleagues worked in Red River, but we were mostly based in the Mekong, which is depopulating and aging, but still has large numbers of people there, 17.3 million, and produces and contributes about 54% of agricultural total output in Vietnam. I mean, just an incredibly productive region, and is facing a great deal of coastal erosion, salination, and indeed drought as well, increasingly. I'm not going to go through these SDGs, you're probably all familiar with them anyway, but we kind of began charting against the SDGs that we thought we could address some of the principles and approaches that we would take. But again, I'll cover those in a little bit more detail as we go. We also had this ambition for what we described at the time as transdisciplinary working, and that quickly became tempered by events as well. So I think it's interesting how you start off these projects, and those are the projects we get funding for, by the way. There's lots and lots of projects we don't get funding for. So these are the ones we get. These are the ones we get money for. I always say the ones we get the money for are the ones that always go, oh my God, we're going to have to do this job. You know, so when we make these ambitious claims to funders usually are quite like that, but then we're left with the problem of delivering it. And against the particular background that I want to describe. So the first thing that happened was changing government priorities. The intractable challenges became simply challenges, which I thought was very, very interesting. There's a start. As governments have come closer to environmental change, they've backed away from action. And I think that was the first sign of that happening in the UK. And then, of course, just as we were sort of heading into the research fieldwork phase, COVID hit. That meant Bangladesh closed down almost completely. Vietnam went into a very strict management scheme with the disease, and we were in and out a couple of times. We began to realise that we were going to have to change how we were going to be doing this project. I mean, it essentially prevented the physical science, which was a large part of that hub from operating for about 2 years. So the boys and girls with the coring equipment who loved to travel the world were suddenly prevented from travelling the world. They didn't become the best colleagues in the world at that point. Whereas the social scientists and humanities scholars tended to come up with other solutions. So we moved to a remote delivery, and we employed people in the field who were already there, and it became a much more collaborative approach, by accident almost, than it would have been by design. So initially we were going to be participating in the field. As it turned out, we changed that and started to collaborate, design collaborative research at a distance. The next thing that happened was government cuts. So the UK government, actually I should start off with the UK university. UK universities, I don't know if anybody here have worked with UK universities, but they're really strong on due diligence. So they force every single university partner to sign up to a code of ethics, to a code of governance, which includes financial governance. It's an incredibly humiliating experience for a lot of our partners to sign up through this process. And what was interesting was the UK, for the very first time, decided to break the contracts it had with its partner universities. So the money that had been promised to the partners wasn't going to arrive. And that put the whole hub in some danger. We were fortunate at Newcastle University, the Vice-Chancellor and the University Executive Board decided to actually pay the money out of the university funds and to replace the government money. But other universities didn't do that, and I think it was a fair amount of reputational damage as a result. And I think it still makes work difficult in some areas. So the three re-budgets, 3 times the budget was cut, and we lost important parts of the hub as a result. And I'll talk a wee bit about those parts we lost and why it was so important. But amongst the cuts that I most regret was the cut to, we wanted to look at freshwater ponds. We were using PhD students to do that, and that whole programme was cut out completely. I mean, we weren't the worst affected by any means, because other projects were 2 or 3 years in, including a malaria mitigation project in London, and that was completely wiped out. And it was like weeks from finishing. So, you know, this took a fair amount of damage. It was done under the cover of COVID as well, or at the back of COVID. So the COVID disease disaster ended up being a financial disaster as well. It meant that our work packages went out of sync and we began to silo quite quickly. So having gone from transdisciplinary, I remember the moment someone said, maybe we should start talking about interdisciplinary. And then it was, sorry, let's just try and get the job done. And there was a fair amount of budget changes and a fair amount of dislocation between the work packages. Overall, we'd been working a theory of change, and that became much weaker. And the other aspect I thought as a historian was we became much more about present day presentism rather than being reflexive about what we were going through. Okay, that's the bad news. The good news is that we actually got a fair amount of work done. And if I run through our aims and just say a little bit about what we did and didn't do before I get to my case study, that might give you a clearer picture of what we managed to achieve and what we didn't. So we said we would create new monitoring of deltas when none existed before to produce new baselines of delta water quality, a new understanding of delta evolution over time. And that is happening. It's happening gradually. I'll try and show you, if I've got an internet connection, I'll try and show you the papers that are starting to come out of that side of the project. What's missing from that, and there's a bit that we talked about a lot before, was that interdisciplinary aspect. And here's an example. The water scientists we were working with wanted to improve water quality. The problem was we came up with quite a lot of local resistance. And our researchers from the humanities side were saying, well, what does the water taste like? And the science was, no, that's not important. Look, here's the list of chemicals. Here's the composition of the water. It's good for people. So we spent a lot of time explaining through interviews how the taste of water actually matters to communities. And initially we were going to build that into the index. So it was going to have a qualitative and quantitative aspect to it. It's ended up only with the quant aspect. So it's an example of where the dislocation happened, but nevertheless we've ticked that box, if you like. We said we'd develop frameworks of localising the UN's SDGs, and again that started to happen. But there's an aspect of that I want to talk about a wee bit more later on today, about where we could have gone, where we might still be able to go. We said we'd create a comprehensive risk assessment framework for deltas. That's economic systems, social economic systems, social environmental systems that will allow us to identify and fill any knowledge gaps in the area of social equity analysis for the delta level. Furthermore, this system will help accumulate the data needed to effectively monitor the systems over time. That is again beginning to happen, and the economists are delivering on that with the environmental science. We'd said that we would mitigate, we attempt to respond and mitigate against foreseeable coastal system tipping points. We are characterising tipping point thresholds and identifying risks and opportunities for coastal areas. We're working quite closely with the a number of NGOs, and what they're reporting is that those tipping points have come up a lot quicker than we had expected. And there's a fairly, I think that's one aim that we're not going to meet. But that's a fairly serious situation to be in at the moment. And so people are talking about evacuating the Bangladesh Delta now. That wasn't the discussion. That wasn't where we were when we started this project. And as I keep on saying, this project's only 4 or 5 years old. Our team is working with Delta communities. We also said our team would be working with Delta communities to gain insight into intricate connections between people's heritage, their current lives, and the impact of human activities and environmental change on Delta regions. That isn't going to happen on any decent scale that we can imagine. We lost most of the heritage team, and most of the museum team, and most of the social science that were connected to that 50. So that's been stripped out in order to deliver this. That's not a story that many people who are involved in the Hub Executive will tell, by the way. I'm a kind of, probably because of my background, this was my part. Okay. However, we actually have delivered disciplinary learnings and outputs, and at least we've done that. Sorry about my email's going to throw up notifications. You can see half my life coming up here, I think. So you can see this is the sort of range of papers that we're starting to produce from the social science humanities side. Please sort of thinking about the methods that might be applied to participatory mapping through to how do we actually work at a distance, surprisingly enough. Or you won't probably be surprised that we ended up writing a paper about what we ended up doing. And then we've also got more science-oriented papers, but not quite hard science, that we've also got within the project on land reclamation, for example, and its impact on delta systems. So I just want to give you an idea of the range of stuff that's coming out of this massive beast. I'm going to risk doing this. I'm going to regret this, never get back, I'll try it. If you go to this link, it's not going to work. If you go to this link, you'll see the list of papers that are coming out of the project. So the science is beginning to happen. Mini buoys have been deployed, core samples have been taken. It's all very exciting. Hotel rooms have been trashed, or bedrooms have been, bathrooms and hotel rooms have been trashed as people taking those core samples and cut them up, and I'm getting letters of complaint from hotel managers across the deltas. So the work is going on, and you can catch up with it. Oh, it's actually come up on my screen, but not on yours. That happened. Okay. I just need to see if I get back to me. Oh Lord. Okay. So you can take a look at that later on. The other thing that's coming out of it, and I'm quite excited about this part, and this is not just for Venkat, this is not just for Venkat's years, but it's something I was really excited about from the beginning of the project. As part of being an oral historian, we've always had this idea of the archival imperative. Because let's face it, and I'm sure this is shared by people in this room, when I interview people about their lives and they tell me about their lives, scientists go, how do you know they're telling the truth? You've been asking this question from at least the 1930s to the Chicago School of Sociology, but nevertheless, I'm prepared to answer it. And answer it by saying there's such thing as subjective truth. So for example, one of the things I'm interested in is the appetite for risk that communities might have, that individuals might have, so that when you make an intervention and introduce a new policy on climate change or environmental change, we understand how people might respond to that. For years, we've been introducing policies that have had countervailing effects or had no effect at all, and puzzled over why, because as we all know, the human race is rational. So, except it's not. So we're really keen on this idea of having an archival imperative in there, so we can look back on the material we collected and see the judgments that we made, but also that other people can look at that material and reuse it and retest it and re-examine it. So we've always held that idea. So it ended up as the oral historians on this massive hub were responsible for the archive, or the repository. And this is interesting because I think scientists have now moved in my lifetime towards thinking about archiving and reuse. However, and there's a really nice study by, it's actually published in the Lancet, and it's about dental, I think it's about dental schools and the publications they produce. And what the authors of the piece did was they looked at every single paper being published on dentistry in the Lancet for the last 3 or 4 years, and they tried to track down the open data. Because it was all, always claimed, the first week, no, our data is available, it's open data. And what do you think they found? Oh dear, yes. Very, maybe 10% of it actually existed. Maybe 20% of it might have existed but was not accessible. And the rest simply was not telling the truth. So we were tasked with setting up this repository. And we've gone down a fairly traditional route in some ways in terms of the FAIR principles, making sure we had a set of common metadata across. And that's been quite challenging as well in terms of thinking about even sort of GPS localities. So that might be fine if you're taking a core or a sample, or you've got a recording from a mini boy about tidal activity. It may be more difficult if you're working in Vietnam and you don't want that particular community to be identified. So you might not want to give away the exact location. You might want to speak about a province rather than a village. So linking the two data sets up has been, a bit, has involved a lot of to and fro and thinking about the ethical and pragmatic reasons for not linking up data. And one of the things we said very early on, we asked, particularly the social science colleagues, not to collect data they didn't need. There's a kind of, one of the things that's happened in the digital age is we collect lots and lots of materials, but for some future purpose that will never happen. So it's kind of being a bit more focused about why you want to collect this data and these details. The data will be open and available at project end, which is 2 years plus 2 years, 2027, and that's to give a chance to the early career researchers to be able to publish and establish their career before other people get access to the data. Okay, the oral history element I'm coming on to now, which will hopefully cheer you up. And this as then is about interviewing people about the life experience of environmental change. Glyburn, Siobhan Warrington, researcher in the UK, a team of 2, which is me and Siobhan. And we worked with younger scientists from Bangladesh who undertook the interviewing of older people. And in Vietnam, we used English language students and who were interviewing younger and older residents. Okay. I mean, the whole project was being really run at this point by, or determined by COVID. What access could people get in the field, what was safe for them to do, what was permissible for them to do, and of course the rules were quite different between Vietnam and Bangladesh. And also the local conditions were quite different. How people responded to COVID locally in the deltas was quite different in those 2 countries. So some of the things that we realised were limitations or difficulties and challenges were the languages that we were working in. And we're still working through multiple translations. There was never going to even be a single language in the localities that we were working in. We're still thinking a lot about the idea of historical consciousness, how people understand the past of environmental change. And as probably most of you know, memory works in a peculiar way that doesn't actually directly translate into history. We don't think in history, we think in memory. And that means that trying to triangulate historical environmental change with how people remember that is challenging, but interesting as well, where people put the emphasis in, the the things to remember and choose to remember, and the things to choose to forget. And it talks, that sort of analysis talks to resilience, and it talks to vulnerability, and it talks to people's appetite for risk. We've been working with our interviewers and some of our interview partners in the interpretation. It's not always obvious what we're being described. I haven't done this today, but normally I would show you some transcripts from Bangladesh that we're working on, and they're really interesting. It's fantastical, the descriptions of cyclones hitting, or even the descriptions of being in cyclone shell are just extraordinary. And extraordinarily moving, but also, you do have to check all the time your own reality with those, because it's outside my ken. I don't live in that environment. So we're constantly going back and forth. People say, is this right? Is this what we're thinking about? The result is multi-author papers of quite a lot of authors. But again, we think that's the correct ethical position to take. We're beginning to try and share our data across the hub for reanalysis, and that's kind of tricky because people are still under enormous pressure to develop, to deliver within their own disciplines. And of course we're publishing, as you see. Okay, so our initial framing as oral historians, we began to realise that in the initial framing as oral historians that when people were using the description delta dwellers, they had a quite, it's like, I'm not even sure what a delta dweller is, but it was the phrase that was being used in both the funding bid and the discussions afterwards with most researchers. So we were engaging with delta dwellers. Who are these people? And it came as a surprise to some of our colleagues that they might be of different ages, for example. Never mind different genders. And lo and behold, different ethnicities was quite a surprise as well. So we began to work with those ideas, particularly with aging. And aging is a process rather as a number or an outcome. And start trying to think about that a bit more. And that's relatively interesting. So in Bangladesh, you say to people in Bangladesh, get through Vietnam, I say, what do you think about who's an old person? And they look at you and go, you. What do you mean, me? I'm not old. So you can pray, you are old. So even from the beginning we've had these discussions about what aging meant, and trying to get people to think about that aging begins the day we were born rather than when we go grey, which is not good. So the other thing that struck me in particular was this idea of, and it happens all the time, particularly in environmental science, and it's partly a result of the climate change movement. The movement's a young movement, and the appeal is to young people. And the assumption is that only young people are interested in environmental change or the environment. And I find that deeply problematic for lots of reasons, not least, I'm not sure that's the way you affect political change, by yelling at old politicians that young people aren't being listened to. I'm not sure that really works as a political strategy. But also it doesn't really work on the ground as I hope I'll be able to show. We're also looking for new potential partners, because I don't know if you've noticed so far, our partnerships tend to be with scientific institutions. So there's a fair amount of frustration on our end that we're working with an engineering university in Bangladesh, but we knew along the road there's a really good social science environmental hub who weren't our partners. So we were trying to reach out to new partners as we went along as well. And we continue to do so. And we were generating new questions, which I'll cover in a moment. So I want to look at this case study from older people in Vietnam to the generation of working. And I'm choosing Vietnam because that was the first area we could do the research in, and that's where we've done the initial analysis or published from. But also Vietnam is really interesting in terms of a country that went to 3 crop rice, for example, and just, if you look at the numbers, the sheer economic numbers of Vietnam, the transformation from about the mid-70s is just extraordinary. possibly even rivaling India. But one of the things that Vietnam has gone, and this may be the path that other countries may follow as well, has been an ageing population. You've probably spotted the historical dip here. It's got something to do with Americans, I believe. But the important thing is probably the direction of travel from 50 to over 70 between 1950 and 2010-15. So the numbers of older people in Vietnam are, sorry, I just was going to do something else, hang on. Are phenomenal. But one of the points I wanted to make was, according to the same source, the UN's population fund, the size of elderly population in India will nearly double to touch 192 million in 2030. But however, by 2050, every fifth Indian will be an elderly person. By 2100, the share of 65 plus population will be 30%, as against the current 7%. So, the case study for Vietnam might be of interest to you. This is a wee bit of work I did based on earlier work by two Vietnamese colleagues on thinking about rice production, resilience, vulnerability, and ageing. Trying to start looking to see if there was any correlation, and there isn't, actually. That was the first thing that was quite interesting. I mean, there is some, you can see areas that are vulnerable, have large numbers of over 65s, but equally so. You find other areas that can find that. I mean, what else was interesting, and nobody else was, by the way, this is because it's my thesis, was on female-headed households. And everyone likes to relive their thesis and try to tell people it was important. So I was trying to, but nobody took it up. But I will come back to that. So it doesn't reveal a correlation between vulnerability to climate change and those demographic factors that I explored. However, in that literature that we began to look at, there's a great deal of information about the movement of younger people out of the Delta. And you can find the same thing in other rural areas throughout the world, that younger people are moving out, older people are being left behind, is the phrase, and I'll come back to that phrase in a minute. And many quantitative studies began to use the qualitative research, in particular the vulnerability idea of vulnerability in ageing, as an index. It's a further index of vulnerability, if you like. So older people, or women in female-headed households, were said to be prone to vulnerability. So therefore, that's what we decided to measure, and it was a measure that people began to rely upon. At the same time, people were talking about the populations of rice-growing villages are ageing, rice sales comprising 20% of household incomes, and high dependence on remittances from younger generation working in urban areas was seen to be a problem and one of vulnerability. In response to market forces, farming practices are shifting rapidly towards mechanisation and sourcing. This again was seen as a problem. So we saw all these things listed up as problems. Farmers are often exposed to significant risks in their efforts to increase profits. And so this was the sort of that dialogue that was going on from about 2014 to about 2020, the narrative. And the shape of the literature up to 2020 tends to emphasise older age as a negative, actually, which is quite ironic if you think how hard countries have actually worked to provide enough nutrition for people to live longer. Now it's a massive problem because all these people are living longer. And there's a similar orientation in the qualitative research, including the grey literature, that older people were left behind. A great deal of stereotyping, as you can see from this is just a number of articles written by this guy in Vietnam about older people in the Mekong. And it's basically just how awful it is for older people and younger people are fleeing the Delta. But I was quite curious about this because I keep on thinking that remittances, for example, might be a positive thing. And when COVID struck, remittances became much more problematic. And remittances from the town, money flowing from the towns into the countryside stopped during COVID because people lost their jobs in the towns. And that was disastrous. But the idea that people sending money from the city generationally, I saw that as intergenerational solidarity rather than conflict. So I began to become more and more curious about the lives of older people in this region. The most sporadic criticism in the literature of chronological age being used as a marker for vulnerability or lack of resilience. But most continue to see age as a critical factor. More recent studies tend to find little or modest differences actually. And this is what's really interesting. When you actually get down to the ground and start doing the work, there's actually very little difference about the socio-economic well-being between older men and women, location actually being a bigger factor. So, where you were actually living. So when you go back to that map, you can see it's the coastal regions that are actually much more vulnerable. Being an older person in the coastal region is much more difficult than living nearer the city, inland. So it wasn't age, it was location. And we began to sort of play around with that and started to introduce this into our interviews. And this is just another study that confirms this about out of 21 input variables, looking at which are the most influential in determining vulnerability to climate change. Age was not influential, but the amount of land you owned, educational attainment, housing, lack of material resources were much more significant than age or whether people were in a female-headed household. And we start to see these inequalities amongst older people. We started to dig down a wee bit deeper, and we found from the government sources there was a great deal of difference, particularly by ethnicity. So kin ethnic groups tend to be much poorer than main Vietnamese groups. 17% of older people are living in poor households, so older female ethnic minorities and rural older people are more likely to live in a poor household than younger male kind of older people. So there is these differentiations and differences. So suddenly the idea of being a delta dweller began to change in the minds of hub researchers. The other thing that was interesting was we began working with some of the gerontologists. Social gerontology is quite young in Vietnam. Social it's a relatively recent arrived discipline in Vietnam, but it's incredibly influential. And they've made the case to the Vietnamese government, if you don't act now, the cost of acting later, they've actually calculated a cost. I don't know if they just made it up, but they said to the government, if you act now, it's going to cost you such and such. If you wait 20 years, it's going to cost you 4 times more. So they basically frightened the government to start thinking about older age. And there's been a series of legislations and policy changes that have come in as a result of that. And what drove that primarily, and that cost, wasn't that you had a lot of older people, it was you had a lot of unhealthy older people. And that health factor became extremely important. And what local medical practitioners were reporting was the prevalence of both depressive disorders and experience of violence was much more likely amongst older women than older men. The reason for that was there was more older women. So there is a really interesting sort of landscape, if you like, that people are navigating now in Vietnam. So, as I say, a number of pieces of legislation came in, including the law on the elderly, which stipulates duties and responsibilities of the family to support and care for elderly patients or grandparents. So the care of the state has been pushed back into the family, which is about what's happening in almost every other country, actually, with an ageing population. At the same time, we're seeing a reduction in household size, so the older people are not staying in those households, staying in other households. This is where remittances come in some ways. Okay. I'm not going to go on about much more about this, but the response also happened in the civil society as well in a number of ways. There was a number of networks. Okay. So we've reached the point of thinking about where our findings are. The first set of findings we came out with was that the change that since 2020 and with the new legislation, there was changes in the status of old people in the relation to the state. Also, those popular representations I talked about before started to change as well in a more positive way. But there was still a need to do more on this question of vulnerability. We were still working within this paradigm in terms of an environmental project that older people indicate vulnerability. And we started to work not just with older people's NGOs, but also younger NGOs, and that led us to begin to change our methods of interviewing. We started to use participatory mapping much more. We started to have a dialogue, intergenerational dialogue between younger and older people in the deltas about seeking solutions. And what was evident from the interviews very early on was that younger people actually would ask older people about environmental change, about why things were different or how things had changed. And older people would ask younger people about access to the internet. And so there was something really interesting began to develop about after 2020. This dialogue seemed to have increased as a result, partly a result of people's minds being focused because of the legislation and the increasing intervention by NGOs. So we started to ask people about to start to draw stuff and discuss stuff between generations. This is a map produced by Imga, female participant in Anfu. And so you can see this grass for cows. This is how the village used to look like. So we could start having we could start holding a historical consciousness that was across generations. So we were actually just tapping into something that already existed and amplifying it. But our first intergenerational findings out of that phase of the project, I think, are interesting. And included the experience of playing in nature during childhood were an important way that participants, both young and old, had formed an attachment to the environment that they lived in. So again, people talked about playing and the spaces that they used to play. So when they did the maps, we didn't actually ask about play, but when they did the maps and talked about where they played. At the same time, the same interviews and mapping was generating the finding that nature resource livelihoods had become increasingly the domain of older generations. And younger people were still coming back down from the cities for key agricultural moments. So if there's a lot of labour required, people would come back, would have a holiday from their job in the city and come back. So there was still movement backwards and forwards by younger people, but increasingly it became the domain of older people. An older woman, 61 years, in Anfu said, about the environment, young people seldom ask about that. They don't even fish in the river. They grow up and learn things, get certificates or degrees and travel all over the place. The people searching for freshwater clams are all seniors like me. And she was exaggerating that somewhat, but it was still the direction of travel. Another woman aged 80 said, in recent years life has changed for the better. Honestly, life was previously a bit difficult. People are also facing difficulties now, but our living is better than in the past. People now have pretty good electricity, tap water and convenient roads. So we've got a different sort of sets of views coming out in terms of modernity. People were speaking about this in level of environmental change and difficulties that we're facing in environmental degradation, but on the other hand there was gains. We began to understand how people were invested in the system at a particular level and how we might try to affect change by building on some of those attachments, if you like. At the same time, there was increasingly perceived problems of litter and garbage. It's really interesting. We're working with a group this week, which has been fantastic actually. But that issue has come up again within that group about the idea of garbage dumping and just general levels of degradation. So, you know, we began the project asking questions about very climate change. And people go, yeah, there's the rubbish people tipping the river. We thought, well, what's the relationship between the two? And I think the relationship between the two is people become almost, people's attitude to the environment changes when that level of degradation is happening at a local level. So people could still talk about the loss of fauna and flora diversity, and that came out over and over again, but was often connected to that degradation. You know, the cause for that loss is modernity, but at the same time we've got tap water. So there's, you know, an interesting sort of complex view of change. The other thing about, if you remember the quote I put in earlier on about mechanisation and the suspicion that it might be a bad thing, everyone thought it was great, particularly older people. So the Vietnamese government, amongst the changes they've made in terms of aging populations, to raise the retirement age. And there have been some expectations there might be pushback on that, but there hasn't been. They haven't gone full France on that at all. What's actually happened there is people are pointing out that mechanisation means you can work longer and more productively. So that, I think, again, is another interesting counterbalance to claims that people are not buying into modernity, if you like. At the same time, we've found that despite state celebration of rice, Vietnam, every time I go to Vietnam, they tell me what awards they've won for the rice. It's just that, and they can just list it for you. They're very, very proud of the rice production. But as we've been pointing out, the stronger the reliance on the paddy, the poorer the household. So that celebration needs to be translated into something, some recognition that the best rice in the world is produced by some of the poorest people in Vietnam. So can we discuss that? All were concerned about the reliance on chemicals in agriculture and aquaculture. It's really visible now. It's not just visible in terms of loss of diversity, it's actually visible on the land and the degradation of the land and water. We're also seeing, and I haven't spoken about this, but we're also seeing a lot more privatisation of commons, also a lot more privatisation of people's heads, so that people, you know, we've got interviews with people who are simply dumping their wastewater from prawns into their neighbours and somehow see this as a bonus. So, and this is a very collectivised society. You know, this is not like Bangladesh. This is a society that tends to think much more collectively, and yet we're beginning to see that process happening as well. We also realised that older people play a critical role in leading activities related to community solidarity and caring for the local environment. So when we looked at the organisations, local organisations, they weren't youth organisations unless they were started by NGOs. Organisations that arose from the ground tend to be older people. And these included, there's a term in Vietnamese which I can't remember, but these included mutual support organisations, which are incredibly informal, but it might just be about organising donations of food or money, you know, for a member of the community. Or another example we had was people donated a day's labour to rebuild a bridge. But these tend to be informal, they tend to be outside the realm of the state. Not that the state isn't interested in that, because it's a great money saving for the state, so they're interested in us finding out more about that, and that raises particular ethical issues, of course. So here's an extra from an interview with an 82-year-old man who reports that this idea of mutual aid has been a long-standing practice in Amphu, where it's also part of the local Muslim tradition. Nowadays, if a sick person doesn't have the capability, the neighbourhood will make donations to help them. Not only the sick people, but also the people that are incapable and are very poor. They've received help from the community. The kind of help has existed long ago. It doesn't just appear recently. Our community doesn't abandon others because people in the society should help each other out. And it's, again, you know, an area that we're interested in thinking about a wee bit further, because clearly it may be a point of common effort to address or mitigate climate change. So our research suggested that older people may at times be recipients of assistance, but they're also acting and organising and providing it as well. And we collected examples of older people's willingness to embrace new agricultural technologies at the same time. This raises critical questions about the typical framing of young people as agents of change and older people as vulnerable and recipients of help. In our research context, older people remain active in their communities and economic activities, including agriculture and social actions, which reflects the importance of mutual responsibility in Vietnamese identity. And we're not necessarily finding exactly the same in Bangladesh, but we're finding similarities, particularly around cyclone reconstruction in villages. But there are silences as well as words in the work that we do, and I'll just finish with this example. In two of the sites that we worked on, there was a reluctance to speak up about the management of environmental issues, which extends both for younger and older generations, and relates to a fear of creating conflict. So Vietnamese society is often based on mutuality and communal effort. That has to be policed at some level, and the policing is evident in these silences. So this is a quote from a 71-year-old in An Phu again, who said he does speak up as an older man, but it says it's not terribly well received by his neighbours. She says, my wife yelled at me all the time, saying that I should not get into other people's business. I felt uncomfortable about that. I not only talked, but I also practiced and set personal examples. Would you like this guy as a neighbour? I don't know. She said that I talked too much and people hated me. So another interviewee said, I want everyone to join hands in order to clean up this place. However, I have no power because people have the right to do anything in their lands. I only keep silent and observant. Now, I think that might be different in Red River. And it might be different in Red River because the Mekong was never collectivised in the same way as Red River was. So we're going to try and test that idea out. But historically, Mekong has always been the frontier, the water frontier. I was telling Gira the other day that there's quite a well-known Vietnamese author who's deceased now, who basically just wrote books like Mark Twain and the Wild West. So he did a series of books that are just almost copies of Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn, but set in the Mekong, in this watery landscape where anything goes and men are men and women are women and crocodiles are afraid or something. So, to finish up, I just want to say what we've been doing this week at NCBS and with the NCBS. So we've taken some of the lessons that I've tried to talk about, and we've tried to work with colleagues across India through NCBS as partners. And we're trying to develop new approaches to large team collaboration and not make the same mistakes again. I mean, isn't it interesting that people who spend their lives thinking about the vulnerability of others and sustainability design projects without that in mind for themselves? I think it's really, really interesting. And we've started to do it, of course. We're thinking about sustainable archive and access. That's working with Venkat, which has been a pleasure. And also, we've now begun, thanks to this middle row up here that you see, developing projects across India, possibly beginning with 10 pilot interviews on environmental change. So we've kind of changed the direction of travel from the big hub. Let's get, I think it was £15 million. No, it must be more than that. It must be £30 million we got. It's just extraordinary. I mean, I think it ended up with 16 months maybe budget cuts, but it's still extraordinary amounts of money. And this project that we've been on this week has cost £10,000. My black hair, all of your hair. But we've got to a position that I feel more comfortable about, even though it's been much slower research. I don't think slow research is bad research, and it hasn't had the same time constraints as the hub. Okay, I'll just finish up by saying what else other work we do in terms of Newcastle Oral History Unit Collective. And you're all welcome to contact me. We're open to all sorts of offers, as you possibly can see there. We've got a project at the moment, hopefully starting in Brazil, thinking about social housing. there's a housing scheme in Newcastle which is it's kind of world famous that people visit it and build their own social housing based on it because it was supposed to be a collaborative effort. It wasn't really, but never mind. We're thinking about women in shipbuilding, we're doing Iraq oral history development projects. We've got treescape initiatives, which is a big project in the UK about thinking about the heritage of trees and the social and economic uses of trees. And we've got a medical humanities section looking at landscapes and environmental well-being. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time and patience. Thank you. Sorry, that was a bit of a cook's tour. But
any questions, comments, or people who do research which has sort of a community engagement approach to like share with us?
I think Indira wants to ask a difficult question.
Thanks, Graham, for talking about the Living Deltas project. The intergenerational interviews you did seem to point towards mutual support among the elderly. Are these in rural areas? Does it differ in urban areas? That's a question I have.
So,
and you can also tell us examples from Bangladesh.
okay, so I think the same thing's happening in Bangladesh as Vietnam in terms of younger people moving out of rural areas, leaving younger people behind. Younger people moving out of rural areas and so-called leaving older people behind is the idea. But we've found both in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is actually, Bangladesh economy, there's more money now being sent back to Bangladesh or within Bangladesh for support, for mutual support, than NGOs spend in Bangladesh, which I think is quite extraordinary. And I'm really interested in that degree of solidarity and that market solidarity between generations, because younger people are working away and sending back. I'm also interested in the idea of propinquity, if I can actually pronounce it. This idea of closeness and how physical closeness is maybe not the thing now. So in Bangladesh, for example, every post office has an internet, and who you see using those internet booths are people contacting kin who are not living in the area anymore. So there's a constant backwards and forwards. And we found the same in other projects we've done of younger people phoning up older people to ask for recipes, for example. You know, yeah, Mum, how am I to cook this? So we've got that sort of solidarity. Older people in cities is said to be less vulnerable in the literature, but we've not tested that out. We've not tested out that aspect. I suspect that isolation might be a bigger factor in the cities than in the countryside. You know, for example, but that, you know, is just speculative until we do the work. But we don't think the literature is right on older people at all. A lot of it, I think it starts from the preconception that it must be awful to be old, and then moves from there.
Thank you.
There's another thing called, you might want to pick up on empty nest syndrome. It's happening around us, all over the place. It's happening in Coorg, it's happening in the villages around Bangalore.
Yeah.
Empty nest syndrome might be more relative.
So this is when younger people move out of the home, leaving older people alone. Yeah, I mean, so one of the couple of slides I skipped through on the civil society stuff is meant to address that in Vietnam. So there's been big older people's organisations for socialisation. So 71% of Vietnamese older people belong to one of the big older people's organisations. The NGOs are also working on that. So we worked on that with Helpage International. So those I think can be addressed. Those questions can be addressed. What's much more difficult is when people have lost contact with the family and there are no remittances. You know, because despite the dependence upon the paddy hasn't translated into economic well-being for those individuals. And now, by the way, the senators that I'm in touch with and who are responsible for Mekong, who are often academics, by the way, are arguing for diversification now, moving away from the three-crop rice. So they're actually talking about bringing back animals, etc., diversifying the landscape. But the labour there, you know, is an older population. You know, so you know, if I'm right about older people's ability to change and older people's ability to draw on past experience, then it may work. But it's a big. I mean, the Vietnamese don't do things by half. When they decide to do something, the state does it.
It's happening with the labours also. The labour families also, they have their things going on.
Yeah. But we were talking this morning, it's interesting, colleagues were saying this morning that, you know, big concern about sand mining. But they were talking about how younger people get jobs or even provide services to the sand miners as lorry drivers or so this, yeah, again, it might be something more complicated might be going on the ground that we would want to know about. Because again, if we make it a prevention, we shout about sand mining, we've got to think that somebody's making a livelihood out of that. You know, so yes, it is absolutely destructive. Yes, it shouldn't be happening, but what are we going to replace it with? And again, the Vietnamese government's response to that question has been to perhaps put industry in the Mekong.
So yeah, going ahead. Yeah, so did you find any change in the perception of ageism in Bangladesh and in Vietnam?
We haven't really analysed the data from Bangladesh now yet, but I think that's a much more difficult landscape in terms of, I mean, there's fewer older people in Bangladesh proportionally than there are in Vietnam. So, you know, if India feels it's a very young country in terms of its numbers of under 30s, Bangladesh does as well. So, I think ageism is a bigger problem in Bangladesh than in Vietnam. But we need to do the analysis.
Question in the back.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. I just have a question. This is something that we are struggling with quite a lot in the field. When we're recording oral histories and traditional, you know, a lot of traditional knowledge also gets passed down. What happens with authorship when we sort of reuse it, share it, give people access? Is it something that you've encountered? And if so, would you have any advice?
Yeah, Indira's laughing because we proposed a chapter to an oral history collection recently, and the editor said she just couldn't take the piece because we had so many authors. So up to now we've been fortunate, so development studies or geography journals don't have that problem, so we've tended to publish there. We have published, and we're just about to publish the methods, the teaching and learning methods in a book, which I think we're the only multiple authored group in the book. So, you know, we got a break there. But it is a difference in paradigm, isn't it? It's a completely different sort of thinking. And I think as an oral historian, I'd prefer to move to a much more shared authority, actually, position, and shared authorship position.
There's a question in the second row.
I'm a person working in the delta in the western coast. Most part of it is lying below mean sea level. The people do pilot cultivation, a lot of people are living there. So the major challenge what we are facing is, as you mentioned,
it's too much.
Yeah.
Too much of an echo.
Okay. So what could be a theory of change in any sort of intervention in this kind of a complex system, especially when you were mentioning that presentism versus theory of challenge. And my next, recently we have done a vulnerability analysis, and we found that rather than the age, is the socio-economic parameters which is leading to more vulnerability. So it may be true not only for this Western coast, maybe for most of Indian deltas. So recently, as a part of the climate change, people are facing a lot of problems, and it's a time we have to recognize climate migrant, climate refugees as a national issue.
Yeah.
But we are still yet to even recognize the term as climate refugees. So people here, one major difference is people who can afford to migrate, they get migrated. But it's more vulnerable people who are caught as the refugees in their own land.
So that was our starting point for this project, for the hub project, was basically, and that's why the British government gave us the money. Because guess who's terrified of migration and refugees? So, and I remember being at the interview and saying, well, you know, you can deal with this now, you can deal with this later. You know. So, yeah, you know, I think it's an incredibly complex problem, and I don't think we've got to grips with it yet. And one of the reasons for having the data repository is so that we can actually continue the work and start to look at each other's research and trying to cross those paradigms. But there's no point of introducing, for example, clean water that people reject, or the politicians. Remember the Bangladesh politicians being very concerned about us cleaning up our water supply and everybody complaining about it, you know? So there's no point of actually producing clean water that people won't drink, for example. So we need to know about taste, and we need to know about people's perception of risk, and people's understanding of disease. And again, the work that the colleagues are doing this week has revealed some of that, so that they've been asking, why do people think this environmental change is happening? And some of the reasons are really interesting. They're not particularly scientific, but they're really interesting. But it gives us a starting point in the discussion with local populations. Because it gives us a point where we can go back to people and not have megaphone diplomacy, but actually say to people, we know your understanding is X. You know, let's think about that, let's work on that, rather than, you know, you need to be doing this, because that is not working. On the refugee issue, I think particularly in Bangladesh, the situation in the Bangladesh Delta is becoming critical. And, you know, World Wildlife Fund people in the region are saying to us that we're beyond tipping point as far as that's concerned. And what's happening amongst colleagues in Bangladesh is they're moving away from mitigation to loss and damage. So the position now is who's going to pay for this? Who's going to pay for this disaster? And that might be, my friends in Bangladesh, I think, take a very hard line on the global north. You caused this disaster, you will pay for it. And I think we're seeing some response through the UN to that. So, you know, again, I think any sort of refugee movement, the global north is going to be bearing a bit of responsibility. Well, not a bit, it's going to be bearing responsibility. Thinking about their deep pockets.
I have two
So the rest will get back, and then we'll come here. Go.
sorry. Yeah, one that
Hello.
You've got a fight here, I think. I think this crowd is before you. You go first. Okay, go first, go. Sorry.
well, the deltas are highly diverse
Yep.
to start with, and therefore the various niches in the delta have their own finiteness of resources, energy and materials in particular. Death control is shaping the demography in part, and the urbanization of the upper part of Delta, which I have seen in the Sunderbans, which imposes a great deal of designed interventions that change the natural course of water streams and therefore ecology, on which the downstream people are usually dependent.
Yeah.
So there are a whole lot of these interconnected influences which are forcing people to not be able to continue as they were living and working before. In other words, you know, sustainability is becoming a difficult issue because there's part which is design, and that design is imposing badly designed consequences on the natural system. So, what does one do under these circumstances? I believe that knowledge has the power of forcing the right adoption of policies. And a metric of knowledge which could be insightful would be the quantification of the resource availability in the region.
Yeah.
And also policy to make sure that the death control, which is going to constantly imbalance the carrying capacity with whatever exists, is going to require some kind of due balance.
Rebalance it.
Which is going to appear in all those kinds of things that you have mentioned about intergenerational and various kinds of things. So is your group interested in designing such metrics?
Yes. So that's a key part of what they call the SDCs. So they're producing graphs to indices of exactly that. But I think what's interesting, the other sort of response we've got is through the UN and the SDGs. So we're also interested in producing an SDG in terms of older people, which doesn't exist at the moment. But also thinking about delta authorities. And one of the things we've learned from Vietnam is to start thinking about these ecosystems as one system. The problem in Bangladesh is that, those developments is that it's local authorities and local politicians who are all pulling in different directions. So upriver, as you say, local politicians are making their careers out of development, which are affecting downriver. Having said that about the delta stuff, then you have to move even bigger, because even with the Delta Authority, the Mekong Delta Authority, the Chinese are building dams upriver, and silt isn't coming down. And that's the big crisis that will happen in the Mekong, is that the annual delivery of silt down the river isn't going to happen because of the Chinese damming stuff for hydroelectric. So, the problem isn't even within the one region or one country. And that's the challenge, is actually trying to get politicians to understand that it has to be international cooperation that will deliver change. Not delivering for their constituents in a locality. But that, I completely agree. So, we're looking at the health, we're basically doing health indices for the different aspects of the delta, including economic sustainability. But that's not my big thing. My big thing is to keep on reminding people who are doing that to take into consideration that people are not rational beings that respond in different ways. And the policy interventions we make, we need to think about what will happen downstream of that policy intervention.
Hello. I was thinking back about the parts in your talk where you were mentioning age was not the factor, but it was more the location. Remittance was really not it, but the fact that it stopped during COVID and so on, and how that was leading us to think that perhaps the wider understanding being that age is a vulnerability and remittance is a vulnerability, maybe these findings challenge those. And I'm thinking all of this is a way of touching upon the fact that science, as it interfaces with work like this, there are challenges and results and inferences can be more complicated. So I just wanted to go a little deeper on that. So I was, at least in statistical analysis for science, sometimes for quantities that you want to test whether they have influence, you also wonder about whether that particular thing by itself has any influence, or whether it has influence as it interacts with something else. Like, for example, age may not by itself explain much, but age in addition to location or some other factors will have a much more significant influence on the quantity that's being modeled. So I was wondering if this kind of social literacy research and all of that has any way of also capturing that, and if so, how does that still affect the challenge between science and this kind of interface?
So you can ask about, so one of the things that older people are vulnerable to climate change is heat. Heat's one of the big things, so we are beginning to start thinking a bit more about that. But nevertheless, people with resources can avoid heat to some extent, yeah. So we still come back to the resources issue. I'm not sure if it is a question for all of us, or if it's a question for other colleagues to be addressing. But we certainly can ask people's perceptions about that. So I think one of the interesting things about working with older people is, I'm going to include myself in there. None of us feel old. When we look in the mirror, we go, who's this fella? I don't know who this is, So I still think I'm 1977, I'm a hunk. When I look at I'm not. So I think that in itself is interesting about, so we can ask about people's perceptions of risk, people's perceptions of aging. But most older people, whether in Vietnam or India or the UK, will say that the worst thing about getting old is being told you're getting old. And a social model of aging, I think, is incumbent on us all to start thinking about before 2050. I think it's interesting that one area. I mean, it's really fascinating walking your campus, and I see colleagues and older colleagues who are hanging in there and still contributing and making your life miserable. I like that. So if older academics can continue to make contribution, it can probably be happening in the general population as well. Which doesn't answer your question, but yes, there are a lot of factors that we're trying to deal with, as you said.
So my question is, the sheer geographical feature of a delta is it's dynamic by itself, right? So when you think about a place, like sense of place and the memory of a place, the place that has been submerged now might emerge because of the deposition result, and over time it might get submerged because of some other, whatever phenomena. So this memory of changing geographical place, how do you find it? Like whether it is challenging to think about a place from a memory of a person, as in like a young person may not be able to see the place that his grandfather would have seen. So when generational transmission of memory as stories happen, if at all it happens, how challenging is it? Like, this transmission of memory from generation to generation.
Okay, so that's why we picked out participatory mapping stuff in particular. So we got younger people to draw how they saw their village, and we got older people to do the same in their childhood. And that's where we start to understand the relationship between the environment in younger age and older age. But the added bonus of that was that transmission of memory. The added bonus was that transmission of memory. So within this group, we can talk about how do you increase that, how do you amplify that. We've been speaking about short films, trying to engage in social media that younger people use. And we're starting to do the same on the hub as well. So the idea is to try and facilitate intergenerational transmission of memory. I think it's really interesting that we began the project, by the way, by saying to the scientists, what are you going to be doing? We said, could you draw a river from your childhood? And then we had to stop them after about half an hour because we were like, I still haven't got all the detail in. And we said, well, that's what we do. And I think you're absolutely right to raise memory as the critical factor in this. But I think there's an appetite. I don't, I probably can do this. I can slag up middle-aged people, can't I? I can do that, if that's okay. So middle-aged colleagues are constantly telling me about how it's the youth that's going to win the day on the environmental battle. I find that endlessly fascinating. Why are they doing that? And I just find that, I find it quite annoying, actually. And I just wonder, it goes back to an old project I did in France many years ago, where the French noticed that when young delinquents came up before judges, and the judge gave them a terribly long sentence, they identified with the judge, not the lawyers. So the project was designed to find out why nobody liked the lawyers. And the answer was, a thing called tri-generational solidarity and conflict. So young people quite like older people. It's their parents that are the problem. So the very fact I've got these middle-aged people going, it's the youth. You know, yeah, you try to identify with them, just grow up. They don't like you, they like your father or your mum. And I think that's still quite, I think that's really interesting. So we saw a lot of that generational solidarity and an appetite to listen to stories from older people, which I was quite surprised about actually. But as I say, some of that was already going on. So yeah, it's not just remittances that's coming from the city, it's also phone calls, people talking about things, and people getting unwanted advice from older people, and that's not how it was in my day. So, which I think is both annoying but interesting for younger people. So there was definitely an appetite, which again we might want to draw upon.
Thank you. I was just wondering, maybe this should be the last question if it's okay. Yes, go ahead.
No, he's not asking, you're asking, he's just...
So this is more of a clarifying question, because in the beginning you mentioned about the taste of water, and that was one of the measures, but then it got left out. So I was curious to understand why, even if it was important, because you mentioned it at the end also, why was it left out?
Okay, so it's left out because we all ran into our different disciplines to get the job done. And we all got very frightened by the fact that, oh my Lord, we've only got 3 years to go and we've got half the money that we should have. How do we get the job done? So that discussions, which had been very good at the beginning in terms of different disciplines talking to each other, disappeared. So we went and we said, well, we're going to get, you know, we can do this remotely. We're going to crack on and get this done. And a lot, as I said, the physical science became just annoyed about having to stay at home. I love to be air miles. I love flying around the world. And we were saying, well, so I think that's when you saw the separation of a lot of the early ideas of trying to do quantitative indices and, you know, all that kind of disappeared, but we just need to get the data.
So are you planning to revisit that idea?
Well, maybe this is the new project sitting in the middle row here. But we've got lots of exciting ideas beyond taste. So we'll see. Well, one of my colleagues can come back and tell you.
Well, thank you so much, Graham. Thanks for being here, and thanks to all of you for being here. We'll wrap up now, but if you'd like to be in touch for further events like this, and you for some reason are not on the archives mailing list and you've not been spammed by us directly, please allow us the chance. We're at archives at NCBS, and food and refreshments outside, so please do join us outside. So again, Graham, thank you.
Thank you.